But yeah, so for context, those listening in, I am getting my computer serviced, checked over because Windows 11 won't update on it for some reason. It says that it doesn't have the specs, but it does have the specs. So there's obviously something in there that I'm missing. And I need to have it serviced because I haven't had it serviced since I got it. So that's like 4 years. So I'm currently on my laptop connected to one of my three screens, my computer, my mouse, my mic. So like every hole in my laptop is filled. Yes, I said that deliberately so that it was uh, suggestive. But yeah, and th this week has been an interesting one for various reasons. I believe, Amelia, you saw on Facebook the conversation that was released from Stuart Armstrong, the podcast episode. Did you react to it on Facebook?
I don't know whether yes, I did. I did. Yes, I listened to it as well. It's actually one of the things I was able to listen to before electric went everywhere and decided
Uh,
to disconnect from everything. So yes, I did listen to I think about three-quarters of it.
okay, nice, nice. I'm curious to get your thoughts on it because I've had a few people reach out about it, which relates to the topic we want to discuss today, which is very deep eco D and active inference. Yes. The
Yeah.
audio, they can't see you evilly, like moving your
Yes, yeah.
fingers. But
It's gonna be one of those. Strap in, everyone, strap in.
so, what were your
No, it was.
thoughts?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, I knew most of it. One thing that's it's quite fun to interact is to have you interact with other people who don't quite know you as well as I do. Because
Okay.
the way you spoke in that conversation is exactly how you speak with me. But everyone, like the social like construction of it all, of like, oh, I don't know whether I can answer this question. You're like, just answer any question, and I could feel the podcast. Stuart, was it Stuart?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could feel Stuart go, huh? Like I could hear it. Obviously not actually. I could hear it in the tone of voice. I'm like, right, okay, I can ask these right. And it was it's quite interesting because we have quite an open, like an entirely open conversation about most things. So it's not news to us, but it's
Yep.
interesting in a podcasting space to have to watch other people react to you because I'm just used to you. Like it's that complete and utter radical honesty that entirely just, yeah, things sucked and then they didn't. And well, I don't really see it like that. Like it's just that matter of factly way you discuss your life and deep, quite traumatic stuff, which most people just won't talk about.
Obviously, I put it lightly, but well, I tried to put it lightly. I'm thinking maybe some people listening could react to this. I'm going to, yeah, friends with a cliff, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's not light. I mean, I think it's light, but I know quite a few other people who would not think that's light.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't at the time, obviously. Um, but yeah, it's interesting as someone speaking with Stuart because I've listened to, for those unfamiliar, Stuart speaks about sports coaching philosophy, and various other elements of skill development slash acquisition, depending on the word you want to put there. And I've been listening to the podcast since my first year of undergrad.
Mm.
So to give you context, that's almost a decade I've been listening to this man talk about sports coaching stuff, and I'd never spoken to him or interacted with him at all. Um, and then when I started Eastbourne Trampoline, one of the dads is a boxing coach, Adam Hanover, and Adam had spoken to Stuart on the podcast before, and Adam suggested that I reach out to Stuart. So the only reason I got on the podcast is because someone I know knew him and suggested I speak to him. Um, and when we reached out, I obviously you heard the start of the conversation. Stuart had actually watched some of my Obsidian videos, which is a bit odd. But he didn't realize it was me in the Obsidian videos. And then when he saw the sports coaching channel or the me channel, he was like, oh, this is actually pretty good stuff. So I was like, yes. Uh, yeah, and the conversation obviously started off personal, which yeah, sure. Then moved into professional, then sort of moved into philosophical as the conversation went on. And one of the videos that was recommended by Stuart to other people in the EcoD space was the one about whether you can do both, whether you can pick and mix ecological dynamics and the other approach. I'm going to say the other because it gets very complicated very quick. So, is there anything you want to ask about the conversation with Stuart that you heard? Any questions you have before I sort of go in and share this
I
experience that I
didn't I
had?
didn't get to the spicy bit, it appears, which makes me sad. I'm gonna go watch the rest later. Now. Listen to the rest later. I didn't get to the spicy bit, which is sad.
It wasn't so spicy in the conversation, but after the conversation, obviously, we then continue. I mean, this was recorded, I think, week 4 of Eastbourne Trampoline. We're now at week 13, so it was recorded a
Oh
while ago.
yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so it was recorded a while ago. It was just released.
Okay, I have a question that's completely unrelated. Like, have you gone back and listened to it?
Yeah, I've listened to it twice.
And what's your reflections from week 13 back to week 4? Like,
Exactly the same. Like, so this is something that I was asked in, which is a related conversation. The Play Their Way campaign currently going on in the UK is a movement via various organizing bodies and physical activity to try and get people to be more child centered. What that means, I could argue for hours because I did the level 2 course as well Saturday, Sunday, which is why we didn't record last week, which drove me absolutely bonkers. But I did it and I've still got another 2 days. So, yes. Um, but the Play Their Way campaign are trying to get coaches to be more child centered, and they're really speaking with child centered coaches. And how do I say this? They they asked us to reflect on what we changed and what we added and what we've done differently to be more child centered. And I was like, nothing. Like, I haven't done anything different. I'm still doing the thing I did when I started. Because they wanted me to change. Okay, I'll rephrase. They didn't want me to change. They were expecting that I would want to add something to be more child-centered. But I'm like, I can't be. Like, unless I literally just leave the room, I can't be more child-centered. There is no more control I can give them, which they actually struggle with to start with. They being the children and adults that I work with, because when I say to a lot of them, there you go, do something you feel comfortable and confident on, like they're like, what? But what do I do? I'm like, whatever you want. And then they'll land on their bum and they'll look at me, and then they'll maybe do a front flip, and then they'll look at me. Well, they'll roll over their head and land on their bum because it never goes to feet. Um, and then they'll look at me, and they expect me to tell them off. So I can't be more child centered. I can be less, which I am in some cases because of what they're doing for safety reasons. Like, let's put a mat on that trampoline in case you land on your face, or just be aware that if you over rotate and your knees are in front of your face, you can knee yourself in the face. Um, that's more of a hey, please don't knee yourself in the face. Not don't do that. You need to do it the right way. Uh,
Mm.
so when they said, "Oh, reflect on being more child centered," I'm like, I can't. And when you said reflect on the podcast, I'm like, I'm doing everything I'm still doing. That would be my reflection. It is working. It is progress. I am seeing lots of success. Um, I wouldn't say I've seen any failures. I've seen people that have struggled but have worked through. But that's just learning.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, it's not it's from I'm quite intrigued like your relationship to thought so nothing's really changed for you then,
no,
you said.
I still doing the same thing I did on week 1. I mean, the only adjustments that I'm changing is I'm adjusting to the people that I'm working with.
Mm.
But that's different only because there's different people there now. Like
Mm.
there's more numbers and there's different faces and there's different abilities because they progress. But that's expected because we live in a dynamic world.
No,
So
we We don't live in a dynamic world. It's all structured and programmed in.
Ugh, yeah. So I guess on that we could
Welcome.
shift. Yeah, that was a segue.
Hmm.
So, for those unfamiliar, this could get complex. And Amelia, please tell me
I will
sort
try.
of tell me to go backwards or not.
Yeah, I will. Trust me, I will.
So to start with, we've got ecological psychology and cognitive psychology as the two typically opposing perspectives. In the book, Introduction to Ecological Psychology, the authors decide to categorize all of those theories and ideas that are not ecological psychology based as cognitive psychology, but do recognize and do explicitly say that there are varying approaches within cognitive psychology. There is a sliding scale, some more robotic than others, some more ecological than others, but they still have the same assumptions which differ from ecological psychology, which are essentially explained in chapter 1 through 4. It's a long book, so it's the first, I would probably say, half an hour of the video that I do on YouTube talking about ecological psychology, the 2 hour video essay. So the first hour covers a lot of those baseline assumptions, some of them being representations in the mind or the head or the agent that is separate from the body. That representation then being used as a picture for the brain, the agent, whatever you want to call it, the central executive, to calculate, to process, to predict the world we live in. And this is where the cognitive psychology arguments get very complex because ecological psychology, although it is new, has stayed the same. Like when you look all the way back at James Gibson, he said direct perception. When you look at the eco psych people now, like Keith Davids, that are actively researching, they say direct perception, no mental representation, full stop. In cognitive psychology, because it is so vast and people have so many different ways to explain things and different ways uh, to justify or different meanings for the words being used, some people say representation and mean we literally have a representation in our heads somewhere controlled by a central executive agent that we process and calculate from. Other people say we have some representations. Other people say we have representations, but they are stored within the body, not within some disconnected agent or central executive. And then you move into enactivism, which starts to bring the mind and body together. So instead of it being a dualist, like Descartes suggested, mind and body are separate, the radical enactivists suggest, well, actually, no, they're not separate, they are together, which sounds very similar to ecological psychology.
Yeah.
But the way
This,
they just,
mm,
yeah,
this is so. If I'm understanding you correctly, this is where the Gestalt kind of piece comes in the radical inactivism and going back and looking at my old research and the stuff that I found out and I learned. I look at it now and go, yeah, but it's still very much computed. If you think about the cycle of experience where we go from sensation to and through that whole process. You're like, yes, but it's still computed and dictated to us versus it being far more complicated. And they even say it's not as simple as we go from this to that, where we go from to withdrawal, we go in, we go out, we go in. It's too simplified, but this is a simplified model that we're using. And it, like, I remember distinctly my relationship between going from Gestalt, which was how I got into all of this is through Gestalt because Gestalt kind of Gibson took some stuff from Gestalt and then went, actually, let's change this. Took some
don't like that.
eh, inspired by.
Well, Gibson came first, like where Gibson's research was came first, because ecological psychology was the initial philosophical approach, and then because science didn't know how to test it, well, this is me very abbreviated version. Because science didn't know how to test it, they tried to simplify it into ways that science could test it. Hence, cognitive psychology and cognitivism and behaviorism and all the rest of it, which most of it now has been left behind by most people, but a lot of people still use it.
No, it's not.
It's left behind in academic circles, and this is where I guess the story continues. A lot of the robot cognitivism, behaviorism is left behind. Conditional, like behavioral conditioning, all those sorts of things, operant conditioning, is left behind by the academics. But the practitioners still use these simplified versions to explain things, which is inaccurate. And then they use the assumptions and the behaviors again, which is inaccurate. But this is where the false dichotomy argument comes in with ecological dynamics and cognitive psychology, because ecological dynamics are arguing against cognitivism, which is not radical enactivism. It is here's a representation, and we have a mental representation in the central executive in the agent, and that is stored in our brain, and then we enact it in the body through motor programs like robots, which no. But those academics in cognitive psychology pushing active inference, predictive processing, free energy principles, some of them, not all of them, don't necessarily believe that. So there are people on the other side, as it were, that are very similar to ecological dynamics. Not the same. We still have different, very nuanced differences
It goes
in
back to that
assumptions.
just the biggest assumption is the fact that it's there's something controlling what we're doing, like a, a thing that is doing a thing
Yeah,
versus it being like just the interaction between the organism and the environment, that the organism affects the environment, and the environment affects the organism, and that it's cyclical. It is just a
they're
thing
coupled.
that they just operate together versus, and then it's interesting because even when you look at some of the more out there on the cognitive side, which are close to ecological, there are still, although they say very similar things, this is what I found, is they say very similar things. Sometimes it sounds exactly the same until you look at the assumptions. And the
Hmm.
moment you look at the assumptions they're making, it's like, oh, no. Or usually what happens when I ask this, what happens when those questions are asked is, oh, we just don't know. It's complicated. I'm like, I know, but what if it isn't? Like, and there is label after label after label after label after label after label after label after
You,
label.
you you really have to dig in to where it comes from, which I've tried, but my struggle is as soon as you push the buttons of radical and activism, active inference, when they say that action and perception are coupled, they eventually, from my experience, lead back to some element of predictive processing, which they argue isn't computer metaphor. And you're frowning. I I don't understand their meaning behind predictive processing if it isn't some level of likelihood. If you are saying, I've seen that before, it's more likely to be this thing, then you are processing something. You're using a most likelihood, which no matter how complex you make the likelihood, is still some element of a tally chart. I've seen this twice. It was
The
an
binary.
apple.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some way, it is a tally chart just overcomplicated, like Bayesian statistics. The predictive processing rules that they use, I don't understand the math, so maybe it is different. I can't see how it's different because the if they understood the maths of it, they'd be able to find the cause. But if there's multiple nonlinear, non-obvious causes, then I don't see where the math comes from unless it's predictive and controllable, which and again, this is where I feel there are the differences between the base nuanced assumptions. Having said that, these sorts of conversations are highly academic and highly philosophical. When it comes to behavioral practice for sports coaches, the radical inactivists from cognitive psychology and the ecological dynamicists from ecological psychology, they behave, yes, I know there's lots of words there, they behave or can behave in very similar ways, and their arguments and rationales towards why they behave At the first two or three levels, it's the same. Oh, perception and action is coupled. We're not a machine. We don't do that. We don't want to repeat the same thing over and over and over again because the world is dynamic. Relationships change. All those things are the same. And that's what most people really need to grasp. The other stuff that we are arguing about in the academic world, we don't have answers to yet. That's why we're still discussing it. um, so the argument that or the discussion I was having with a couple of people from the radical and activist side were that they argue that there's a false dichotomy because you can pick and mix between ecological dynamics and radical and activism because you could use either explanation to describe the behaviors. And I agree.
Mm.
I agree there is a false dichotomy when you measure radical and activism and ecological dynamics. Unfortunately, the majority of coaches, the majority of individuals and academics and philosophers and psychologists that argue from cognitive psychology that aren't at the forefront of the research believe in the machine metaphor and use
Mm.
predictive processing, especially when it comes to skill acquisition, learning and development, learning scientists. And that is the dichotomy that ecological dynamicists are trying to argue against, which is where I feel this conversation of the dichotomy comes back to fractals.
Yeah, measurement.
It depends on the measure. If you are
Mm.
looking at the forward-thinking academics, I agree. There is a false dichotomy. There is not a pick this or pick that, because both explanations could explain behavior. But when you expand that fractal just a tad to like the 2010s, you then start bringing in people that are different. And one of the people I was speaking to agreed that I described this in an analogy that we are three football teams. We used obviously a sports analogy here, three football teams. And two of us are at the top of the league pushing the boundaries. But the other team is way behind and hasn't got a clue what's going on. But for whatever reason, us two at the top of the league are fighting each other. And we're not fighting the other ones as much because we're so busy fighting each other. And on X, it's rife. And I'm like, can we just agree to disagree and fight the good fight and get rid of all this other rubbish coaching like VARC learning styles for sake? Yes, that was a manual mute. It was a manual mute of swear words. And that's where I've got to with this discussion. I recognize I've just spoken for a while there.
It reminds me, I had a similar experience recently in nowhere near at the same level, obviously, um, of understanding, but
I have tried to simplify that, by the way.
thank you.
I was like
I
changing the
appreciate it.
words halfway through my sentence.
It's beautiful. No, I followed, which is nice. So I appreciate it. Yeah, I was having a similar like example when someone posted in a Facebook group, in a business Facebook group, about how shocked they were on how their INFJ
Yeah,
personality test changed.
Myers-Briggs is INFJ,
Myers-Briggs,
isn't it?
which has been completely and utterly dismissed so many times in academic and non-academic literature,
Yes.
but people still want a label because labels make them feel better, I assume.
Well, I think yes, I agree. I think it's also with that they try and it's a diagnosis tool. Like they use it as a diagnosis tool, and they try and put behaviors, symptoms on the label diagnosis, and then try to fix the symptoms, the behaviors, which is just a load of bull poop, cow manure, whatever you want to describe it as. It's just dung.
Mm. And people
It,
have real reactions towards it. And I'm like, this can only ever be as accurate as it is in that specific moment that you take that specific thing, and it is looking for specific, it is so highly constrained to your current experience, to the questions that are asked, to the answers that you give, because they're all being pushed in a certain direction, because that's the idea is you must fit into one of these, I don't know, four or five or however many boxes
16.
there are. 16, thank you.
Four
16
times four.
letters. And I'm just like, but it's far more interesting than that. Like it's far more complicated and dynamic and more.
This is the thing with the test is they started out, I believe, those that are familiar with the research, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they started out with four, then recognized there were other areas. So they added some letters and they added letters. I think it got up to 24 different sort of archetypes, I think they're called.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm like, you're just expanding it to try and group different behaviors because it doesn't quite fit that one. Why not just recognize actually we're all different? So why bother grouping? Like, why bother grouping using these letters to try and categorize behaviors when we know behaviors differ drastically? Same with the introvert extrovert argument. Sod off. Are you an
I,
introvert or an
I, I,
extrovert?
I
Yes.
Aiden this morning I was like, yeah, because I was looking for my inhaler before today because I had to unplug all the stuff in here because storm. And I was looking for my inhaler, couldn't find it. And Aiden was like, "Have you checked inside your bag? Have you taken it out with you?" I said, I haven't been out in a while, and anywhere I do go, I'm going from a car to a room and a room to a car, so it's not going to come with me. And Aiden was like, "Oh yeah, that's because you're introverted. We're all introverts here." And I'm like, "No, no, 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 no." My reply was simply because I didn't have time to even enter this discussion right now. Was that's grossly simplified, and it depends on on the scenario and the situation I'm in. Sometimes I could be incredibly don't want to talk, and then other times I can't wait to talk and have conversations and be outwardly blah 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 blah. So it doesn't make sense. It's so context dependent and environment dependent and environment specific, and the relationship between the individuals and the organisms together, and different organisms are and how they interact with the environment around them and how I interact with them. And there's too many things to just
This is what drives me nuts about the introverted extroverted argument is that people assume introverts, symptom, don't talk and don't go out and don't socialize. Now, as me, someone growing up half deaf, I can't talk in a conversation if I don't understand the conversation. So maybe I'm not introverted. Maybe I just don't understand what's going on. Like maybe I just didn't hear what was going on. And when I go out to the deaf meetups in the pub, some of them are from the BSL Level 1 course, and most of them don't sign because they're learning to sign, which means I don't. It's not a deaf meetup, it's a hearing meetup, i.e., everyone can hear and everyone's talking, that people are learning to be deaf aware with. The teacher is deaf aware, but when she's in a pub and she's socializing, sometimes she forgets that I'm actually half deaf because I don't sign. She's like, oh, sorry, because she like covers her mouth with her hand because of whatever, or the glass is covering her face. Um, and those situations are exactly the same as other situations a lot of the time because they forget that I'm half deaf because I can hear and I understand most of what's going like 70, 80% of what's going on. Um, and to me, I'm not introverted. And most of them, when speaking to them, they think I'm a very confident, extroverted person. But if you go on, oh, how much do you talk in the conversation? Well, I'm very introverted because I spend so much time trying to understand what people are saying, what the topic of conversation is. And then by the time I've thought about what I could add to the conversation, they've moved on to the next topic. So I'm like, oh, okay, carry on, keep going. I'll sit here and I'll add bits in where people maybe ask me or something because I'm keeping track of the conversation. If they say something and they ask me, I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. But otherwise, I'm like, I'm I'm an observer. I'm more I'm more of an observer than a contributor to the conversation. That doesn't make me introverted.
Mm.
And like I say, most of them assume I'm extroverted because I talk a lot when I talk. And I'm like, forget the label and like the diagnosis and the symptoms, forget those things because it's just a behavior. You don't have a clue why someone's behaving like that. And it could just be that they struggle to hear or understand what's going on. But yeah, that's my mini rant for the episode.
But now they've got ambiverts now.
I'm familiar with the term, but I don't really understand the difference.
Both depending on the situation.
Yeah, so I don't understand the difference. Like, what's the point of it? I recognize I'm asking you and you sound converted on my side, so you're probably like, I don't know what their argument is. Am I accurate?
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
But
Sorry, am I?
that is the most accurate. Like when everyone talks about this, it's like, oh, well, I'm more of an ambivert. I'm like, no, you're just someone who communicates in an environment and you attune to specifying information and joining the conversation when you can or want to or have something to say.
Yeah, yeah. You are.
Okay?
You're not an ambivert. You're a person that talks when they feel confident or competent enough to contribute to the conversation, just like everyone else. Well done. If you're not confident enough or competent enough to contribute to the conversation, then that is where you would develop your understanding of either the conversation, the topic, language, like learning the language. For me, I'm learning BSL. Some people need to learn spoken English because their vocabularies are extremely small, which makes communication difficult because all they do is swear. And that is not helpful when trying to explain details in conversation. Hint, hint, younger people that just swear every other word. Uh, I recognize that's probably none of this audience,
My
but
two.
but those sorts of symptoms, I don't think are useful to label. Just talk. And so this is something I was discussing at the Deaf Pub yesterday. The the conversations that older generations have are very open. They're very blunt, and I I treat this as a safe space. Those listening, feel free, obviously, to turn mic off or whatever. But when yeah, I know not turn mic off, turn earphones, headphones, speakers, whatever off. But race, okay? Deaf people, when they are describing a person, say black person or Chinese person, and use signs to describe that as a person, right? Person with a beard, person with long hair, tall person, short person, etc. They don't understand the conversations that are happening online about not being able to use descriptors because it is sizist, racist, ageist, whatever ist. They don't understand it. And they were asking me to explain what words they could or couldn't use. And the answer is always, well, it depends who you're talking to.
Mm.
And they were like, well, how do I know who I'm talking to unless I say it in the first place? I was like, that is a great question. I don't have an answer to that because it will always depend, um, which makes communication very limiting. And I think that is because we've added so many labels, diagnoses, symptoms to people and categorizing things that we don't know what we can and can't say to people. So we just don't know what to say, or we end up having an argument in ourselves going, right, I could call them this, or this. If they think this, then I can't use that. If they think that, then I can't use this. Maybe I say this, but then they might think I'm doing this or that I believe that, which I don't, but I want to make sure that they know that I don't believe that. So I need to say that first. But if I say that first, they might think I think this, and you haven't actually said anything yet.
This has been my quite a lot of my lived experience recently. So I can't remember whether I was last time, but at least since previous conversations that I am now fully out as a trans woman. So no one doesn't know, including in every single one of my groups and including all of those like relationships, D&D groups, and everyone sort of knew, but were too scared to ask. And I found that really interesting because all people needed to do was ask, and I would have answered very, very simply. And it was really interesting. People were like, yeah, I saw the change in clothes. I saw all these changes. Now, for me, due to dysphoria, I don't see myself as very different at all. I do not perceive myself as any different as I was before, which is sucky and shit. But there we go. Um, but just hearing people, you look so different. I'm like, oh, that's really nice for one. That's nice for me to hear, to actually know that. And also, it was really interesting when people felt they're like, "I'm so sorry, they dead name me," and everyone freaks out. They actually get really scared. They get really, I'm really sorry. I'm not that kind of person. I'm like, I know you're not because you didn't react aggressively or nastily or rudely. Well, you may have been perceived as rude by someone who doesn't get it, but from my perspective, of course you're going to dead name me. You've known me as that dead name for most of my life, if not all of my life. Like, of course you are. It's just a practice. I'll remind you and let you know. Yes, it does hurt. Yes, it is hard. But that's me. I know you're not coming in it from a point of I want to hurt you. I know the intention. I can tell intentionality when people accidentally dead name me versus actually trying to. And they're on purposely trying to make me feel belittled. And then I just say bye and I don't care. Like, most people are just genuinely nice people who are just making a mistake because they're using familiar language that they're used to. I'm like, fair enough. Others have picked it up really quickly, and some haven't. And some still, I dead named myself the other day, which was horrific, but hilarious at the same time because I just turned around and went, no, I haven't been, no, that's, yuck. But also, if I don't get angry when people accidentally dead name me because how could I? It doesn't even make sense to me.
And I agree, but the issue there is you or me or whoever doesn't know
Mm,
how, like, we can't read other people
mm-mm.
and what they're thinking. Like, we don't know exactly what they're thinking. We can predict, not as in predictive processing machine, but predict what they might be thinking and try and gather information from what we can sense, i.e., how they react, their facial expressions, their body, their behaviors, whether the behaviors changed now to what they did before. But you can never truly know and
No, of
understand
course
because
not.
a person can never truly know and understand at any one time because it's always shifting. So you will never be accurate enough to say I'm right and you're wrong.
Mm.
That's life. Like that's life. You can't change life. Life is dynamic. End of. Um,
It was nice because most people just didn't care. Most people had a very similar reaction to you. Like, yeah, cool. Let's carry on with the conversations. Like that's it. You just this you just someone else and you're changing who you are, but you're also not. Just represent if you're representing yourself as you wish to be, as long as you're happy, who cares? That's literally it. And I'm like, cool, which is all it needs to be.
I
Unfortunately,
think
it's been very political.
yeah. I think the politics and again the comparisons.
Yeah.
When it comes to ecological dynamics and information processing, like we've just discussed, the comparisons, like the pick and mix comparisons, if we look backwards in time, EcoD is radically different from computer metaphors. But if we look at EcoD and radical inactivism, well, actually, they're very similar.
Mm.
When we describe people in any way, there is a comparison. Is the comparison a modern comparison or a historical comparison? If it's a historical comparison, then people typically are more worried about it because there's more information there that we are familiar with and used to, i.e., your dead name has been used far longer than your current name.
Yeah.
So people are more worried about the dead name and using, not using appropriately, using it wherever. Um, but it's still helpful information because it's part of the process. If we move out in fractals, it's still part of your history.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like it took me a long time to choose a name because I wanted one that represented me and didn't abandon what who I was. It's just an evolution of me.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, a name is just a label. It's just another label.
It's letters put together which represent as symbols that we use to describe an organism, which is used to make communication or meant to make communication simpler. But if it doesn't make communication simpler, what is the point of it? Which brings me back to what I was discussing a couple of weeks ago when it comes to removing labels. Like labels were meant to be simplifying communication, but at this point right now, it's complicating communication to the point where people just don't talk and they bottle everything up inside because they don't know how to communicate. And that's not a they don't have the words or the language, it's the society is restricting language so much they don't know what they can and can't say, which gets into freedom of speech discussions. I don't know if you want to go down that route, but it's it's challenging. Go on.
There are so many multiple layers to that conversation, which we didn't. We could be here for an entire podcast episode just discussing that.
We could.
Action
Do,
capabilities.
do you want to expand?
No.
Okay. Okay, fair enough.
We don't have enough time to expand, I think. You made this podcast earlier for a reason. We would not stop.
True. True.
Like, we would go down one heck of a rabbit hole that would take a while to get back up and leave people very unsatisfied.
It depends. There you go. Conversation
Yeah.
conversation ended. It depends.
Yeah.
Right. Um, I feel like I've covered what I wanted to cover because I wanted to do a video, or I want to do a video on discussing the force dichotomy discussion. Um, and I wanted to, I mean, that's what this podcast is. This conversation is discussing points and seeing how we would articulate it to other individuals.
Mm.
How would you articulate it to round it up? Is there a
How would
force
I
dichotomy?
articulate this conversation of all the false dichotomy?
Yeah.
Um,
Do you believe there is a force dichotomy?
yeah, there is that. Yes, when we go, it depends on the measurement. Depends on the fractal we're measuring. But yes, if we're looking at just the, I also think, and this could be radical of me, I don't know. It just doesn't matter. If we remove the nonsense, like we can discuss this for ages. Like I enjoy this conversation, and many people do. This is a lovely academic-ish conversation. It's interesting to explore philosophy. It's interesting to do. But from a daily practical sense, people are struggling because of the label. Like I believe people are struggling because of all the labels that have been shoved into what we're doing. And like, oh, cognitive processing and this and that and inactivism and like all of this stuff is so complicated. People are too going back to what we were just saying, too scared to make a mistake. People are
Mm,
too scared to do something, so they just assume that they can't. There is
yep.
just the overall assumption they have no ability to do that. They have no ability to go beyond the executive functioning because they have executive dysfunctioning. Because they are dysfunctional because they don't function based on an executive, because they don't need to, because it doesn't exist, because it's a placeholder. So if we remove the placeholder and we look at the behaviors and we look at the action capabilities that we have, then it becomes a little bit simpler, or can become a little bit simpler. because then it's not about, well, I can't do this because I am dysfunctional. It's okay, I have these capabilities. I am blind in one eye, I am deaf in one ear. Opposites. Great. Those are parts of my action capabilities. Those are the things that I need to consider. So
I'm the
how
same
do I
side, just saying.
Mm, mm,
I'm different. I'm
mm,
similar but different.
mm. Couldn't have been the same side for me. Yeah. And if we strip that all back and we just look at the individual and their interactions with the environment, it's so it's so much easier.
Hmm.
It's it's even just something as simple as buying clothes, for example, because of course that's what I'm doing right now. It
Hmm.
was, "Oh, I don't know whether you'll be okay with that." I'm like, yeah, I might not be now, but I'm not thinking about the clothes I need now. I'm looking at the clothes I need in 6 to 9 months when I've been on HRT for 6 to 9 months and my body has completely changed shape,
Yeah.
hopefully. Like that's what I'm considering. Oh, yeah, well, that won't work now. I'm like, I know it won't work now. That's the point.
Yep.
Cool. And I don't even know whether I like it, but I'm not going to know unless I buy it and try it. How do you know it's not going to work? In fact, one of the things that I was told wasn't going to work actually worked
Hmm.
because I looked, because I tried. Instead of going, oh, I must stick to these things, it was a case of going from, okay, that, for example, that skirt is too colorful and so doesn't match with this thing to go, okay, well, how do I make it? Because actually, here's what I want to do. I like that one. I like that skirt. It makes me happy. It's fun. How can I make it work? Okay, cool. Well, if pair it with, let me try pairing it with this. Let me try pairing it with that. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, that's really good. I'm like, yeah, I know. Because I'm pairing things together and I'm just trying to do it versus trying to get the answer because there's only one answer because we only have one result when really there
Sounds
is.
very similar to practice.
Yeah, crazy, right?
Who would have thought practice and learning has mistakes in it? Never would have guessed.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Right. I think that covers everything.
Pretty much. Very much.
So speak to you all next week.